Hey everyone, thanks for jumping into week 4 of Made New. This week we talk about how a new vision actually frames all of the pieces we've already put together. New limits, new rhythms, and new support all create space, but only in the direction of a God-centered vision. Listen in.
We celebrate a lot of things around here. We celebrate any step that anyone takes at any point along the way in Jesus' direction. Whether it's a first step of checking things out, asking big questions, the first time opening the scripture and asking God, what do you have in store for me? A great conversation with a friend, and all kinds of steps along the way for people just figuring out who Jesus is and people who've been following for a long time. Every step in Jesus' direction we want to celebrate. But there's something really strong about that moment where we go from, I've lived my life kind of in and around or without Jesus, to from now on, it's me and him. And in our church, that moment is marked by baptism. We see in the scripture that this picture of a burial underwater and a resurrection mirrors what Jesus did on our behalf. And so for any of us who are pointing our lives in Jesus' direction, if you've come to a place where you're saying, look, I don't think I ever want to go without God. I don't think I ever want to be without Jesus. I want him to be the leader of my life. I believe he's rescued me, and I want to head his direction. The next step is baptism. And so I just want to encourage you, if you haven't taken that step, you haven't done that, we will figure it out. People have pools, they're heated, it's all great. We find ways to do it safely, even in COVID. And so I would encourage you, if you haven't done that, consider that step. If you need help figuring out where and how to do that, you can text Made New 21 to 94090. You see it pop up several times during the service. You can catch it another time if it doesn't magically pop up right here on the TV right now. Just kidding. I didn't ask for it, so it's not going to happen. Anyway, but listen, pointing your life in the direction of Jesus is always the very best thing that you can do. All right, so listen, we are going to step into week 4 of this series about being made new. We are launching into 2020 expecting that the best is yet to come, that God has good ahead, that we don't have to settle for survival, that thriving actually is an option, that God has things in mind. And while things haven't gone or may not go the way that we always imagined, God is still at work. He's always up to something. And we've been doing this out of a book in the Bible called Daniel. So I want to encourage you to grab your Bible and go to the book of Daniel. It's in the Old Testament, the Hebrew scriptures. You can find it in the table of contents if you brought a Bible, or if you didn't, no worries, because you probably brought one of these. You can jump onto the App Store or whatever and download the Bible app. This is the easiest one, free, cheap. We have nothing to do with it. It's just great to always have. And this is the scripture. You can take a picture of this right now, and you can dive into this with some friends. There's some great questions at this website for a way for you and your family, you and your roommate, you and a friend from some other state on Zoom, you and your life group to sit down and listen to God together in the scripture. One thing we don't always share around here, for those of you who might be stepping into a new habit this year of really listening to God and his word, is what do you read? Like which version do you buy? Which one are you supposed to choose? And so real quick, bottom of the app, just choose read, and it'll open some scripture, probably Genesis 1 if you've just downloaded the app. But at the top, you can choose the book of the Bible and the chapter, of course. And then over here, what we use is the NLT, the New Living Translation. If you just click on that, there's going to be a long list of translations. NLT is what we read around here. So if you want your words to match what we're reading, it's great. There's also all kinds of other great versions. If that doesn't sing to you, if it doesn't resonate with you, there's other great translations we can point you to. Listen, let's imagine for just a minute, as we dive into week 4, imagine just for a minute, I said, look, you need to pack, you need to get ready, and these are the people that are going with us. What's your next question? Where are we going, right? How would you even know what to pack until you knew where you were going? Like a couple years ago, we decided that our family was going to travel through as many national parks as possible. And we got 4 kids, and we're not going to deal with hotels the whole way. So that creates a very different packing list than if you're about to fly across the country to visit family, right? And even if you're flying Southwest or you're flying Allegiant, you are packing differently, right? Because the cost is so different. It matters. Like the limits that you set around what you would want to take depend on where you're going. The way you would prepare for the trip and the way you would time your meals and make sure you got bathroom breaks and drinks and all the kind of stuff along the way that you would need for the trip. The rhythms that you would embrace, it depends on where you're going. The same would be true for the people that you would take along with, right? Depending on where you're going, it'll inform your limits, your rhythms, and your support. And so listen, as we kind of bring this whole series together, that's where we're headed. We've been saying for the last couple or 3 weeks, we said, listen, if we're going to go somewhere new in 2021, if God's going to make us new, if we're gonna step in with hope and potential and realize a different kind of capacity and step into a thriving life instead of a survival kind of situation, what we're gonna need are some things. We're gonna need some limits. We're gonna need to step back from some things and set some limits so that there's some fresh space for God to do something new in our lives. We're also gonna need some new rhythms, right? So limits would be like, how much can I pack? Rhythms would be like, how are we gonna travel? How are we gonna get there? What's the pattern gonna be along the way? We need new rhythms in our life to invite God to speak something fresh and new into our world, whether rhythms of gathering with others, praying, inviting God to speak to us through the scriptures, and any number of other habits that we talked about. We need some new rhythms. And we've been exploring those a little bit. We're also gonna need really great people around us because the journey has everything to do with who you're traveling with. Like, listen, when you load up 4 kids that are in elementary and middle school and you plan to drive for 2.5 weeks staying in a tent, you are never apart, right? That's gonna change how it goes. One of my favorite things was when people started to get cranky in the car, there's nowhere to go, right? So we had this towel with lobsters on it that we called the Krabby Towel. And anybody that got cranky just had to go under the Krabby Towel until they weren't crabby anymore. It was awesome. Who you travel with matters. And so if we're gonna step into a new year, we need the best kind of support around us. And we wanna show up for really great people around us as well. We wanna be and have great friends, right? But all of that needs a context. It needs a direction. We don't just need a packing list people to travel with and how we're gonna get there. We need to know, where are we going? And so listen, week 4 is this. Not only do we need new limits, rhythms, and support, we also need a new vision. Vision is really simple. It's just a picture of how things could and should be at some point in the future. And as you start to think, I wanna invite you, sure, have a vision for 2022. Right? That 1 year from now, if you were to sit in the same place or wherever you find yourself sitting, that something will have changed that you could look back and say, yes, it was challenging. There were surprises, there were twists, there were turns, there were all kinds of things, but it's so worth it. God has brought us so far over the last year. But even beyond that, I wonder about a vision that reaches farther. In fact, how far could you imagine into the future? Sometimes when we transition from one year to another or from one season to the next, we look back on the previous season and we say, oh man, there's all kinds of things I hope we can leave behind and never pick up again. And we move in opposition to what we didn't like from before. But a better way to think about vision is, how do we move forward? How do we imagine a different future that's not just a move in opposition, but is in a direction that we actually desire and dream to go? Our hope is that over the next week or so, that in conversation with you and God and your people, that you would arrive on a vision that just lights you up. You're like, yes, this is where I have to, I cannot not go here. I cannot not become this. I have to do this. And when we have that kind of vision, when it kind of lights that kind of fire, when it's inspiring enough, when we put enough like dream and language and strong things around it, we're just like, yes. This is a line in the sand. I am going this direction. It provides a context for those. It makes the limits worth it. It makes the rhythms necessary. It defines the kind of support that we will need around us to really go somewhere that inspires and challenges us, that's worth dreaming about. So I hope for some great conversation with God and your people around you this week. But let's frame it up really, really well. We're gonna do this from the life of Daniel. Daniel was this guy that we've been talking about. I encourage you to read like chapters 1 through 3. He's a young man, teens and 20s, who was dragged out of his homeland into a totally foreign place, dropped into 3 years in the Royal Academy, and became a servant to a king who believed none of the same things as Daniel. But he was awesome. He drew some lines and said, I will become this sort of person. And in Daniel 1 through 3, you see him set a trajectory for his life that is strong and inspiring. By chapter 6, though, we actually find him at the end or nearing the end of his life. He's probably in his 80s. He's in and around 80 years old at this point. And so if you're imagining a point in the future, maybe you should think about, where will you be when you're 80? Some of you are like, that's 3 years ago, bro. Imagine forward, okay? Wherever you are, as far as you can imagine forward, imagine there, right? Where are we? What will that look like? Who will you be? What sort of person would others describe in that moment? What we're gonna look at is a way in which Daniel was described, even by people who didn't share his values. And my hope is that as we look at this, as we look at the character of this guy, it starts to light a fire within us of the sort of person that we want to be out there. Because if we imagine and dream out there being like that, that will demand something of us right here in terms of limits, rhythms, and support. In Daniel chapter 6, like I said, he was like put into the governing authority of this foreign land because he was so capable. He was so strong. In fact, in Daniel 1, I think it is, we find out that he was 10 times more capable than all of his classmates at the Royal Academy. And so the king puts him in positions of power. Well, he follows a long line of career, and we catch a picture of this somewhere 60 years into his career. In Daniel chapter 6, verse 3, it says this: Daniel soon proved himself more capable than all the other administrators and high officers. I just think it's awesome that this guy's peaking at 80. It's so cool. It's awesome. It's the best. Because of Daniel's great ability, the king made plans to place him over the entire empire. Now, the context I skipped is that he was one among 3 who are up for the job, and Daniel's about to get it. Now, you can imagine how the other 2 respond. Verse 4, then the other administrators and high officers began searching for some fault in the way that Daniel was handling government affairs, but they couldn't find anything. Look at this guy. Look at his character. More capable. He has such a high capacity. And even when people try to poke and prod and find dirt on him, they got nothing. So listen, Daniel was they were looking for it, but they couldn't find anything to criticize or condemn. He was faithful, always responsible, and completely trustworthy. I love this. This descriptor of the people around him at this season of his life. What an amazing character. So they concluded, I love the way they're going to get at him. So they concluded, our only chance is finding grounds for accusing Daniel will be in connection with the rules of his religion. They were like, the only way to trap this guy is doing something we know he won't compromise. I love it. He's so reliable, consistent. His character is so defined and clear. They were like, we're going to have to find something he loves about himself, something he's defined about himself, and create a trap around it. And so they do. They convince the king to say, listen, people should only be able to pray to you, king. And so he makes an unchangeable law that for the next amount of time, anyone who prays to anyone other than the king himself will be thrown into a den of lions. And you can imagine about how that will turn out. Well, sure enough, Daniel, he for his whole life had this rhythm of praying 3 times a day, spending time with God. And these were not rules of a religion for him. To these pagan administrators, they looked at Daniel and they saw his practice and they said, well, he must be doing that because he's afraid of God. He's just trying to appease the gods in the way that everyone else tried to appease all of their gods. But that's not what it was like for Daniel. Watch Daniel's life. He rested with God. He enjoyed God. He relied on God. He experienced God's favor. This was not a religion. This was relationship between he and God. And he was not about to compromise it just because some king threatens to end his life. And he doesn't. This is the kind of character that he had. And so sure enough, they trap him, they catch him, and the king's devastated. The king loves Daniel. You got to read this whole thing. I wish I could tell you the whole thing, but you got to read it. The king loves Daniel. He spends the whole day trying to find a way out of his own law, but he can't do it, and we see this in verse 16. At last, the king gave orders for Daniel to be arrested and thrown into the den of lions. But the king who doesn't care anything about God, the king who doesn't know anything about that, there's thousands of God in his empire. He doesn't believe in any of them. You know who he believes in? He believes in himself, right? That's why he would make such a law. But look at what he says to this guy, Daniel. The king said to him, may your God, whom you serve so faithfully, rescue you. His last words were to describe Daniel as one who serves his God so faithfully. Listen, that's a character worth admiring. Who he had become over 80 years in captivity was epic. Now, spoiler alert, they throw him in. He doesn't die. But in the meantime, the king is distraught. He skips his meal, skips his entertainment, everything, and he spends the night in anguish and finally comes back to see what happens the next morning. In verse 19, very early the next morning, the king got up and hurried out to the lion's den. Kings don't hurry, but he did this day. And he calls in, when he got there, he called out in anguish, Daniel. Look what he says about Daniel. He can't even say his name without saying this. Servant of the living God has, I lost it. Servant of the living God was your God who you serve so faithfully. He says it again. Was he able to rescue you from the lions? I wonder if people speak about us like this. When people describe us and the people that we're becoming, do they speak with us with the same honor, with the same acknowledgement? Even though the king didn't believe in the same God, he still acknowledged, you serve this God faithfully. Your God is a living God. Was he able? Like all these kind of questions. Do people think about us that way? Daniel apparently had this rhythm of serving others really well because he was serving, and apparently along the way he had done a good enough job communicating, listen, the way I serve, the way I live has everything to do with the God that I follow. He had some rhythms. He had set some limits. He had lived a life that created a legacy of impact. And Daniel gets the privilege of responding in verse 21. Daniel answered, long live the king. My God sent his angel to shut the lions' mouths so that they would not hurt me. For I have been found innocent in his sight. And I've not wronged you, king. I've not wronged you, your majesty. Still honor, still respect for the very king that threw him in with the den of lions. But he says, listen, my God rescued me, bro. This is how it played out. I spent the night hanging with lions. What'd you do all night? You look like you haven't eaten. Are you okay? This isn't how it went, but that's just in my imagination. That's how it went. Listen, here's the thing about a vision for our lives. Daniel had almost no control on what he would do with his life. He had almost no control over how things would develop over time, but you know what he had control over? You know what the kind of vision that he must have had for his life was for who he was becoming. And his legacy and his impact had everything to do with who he was, not what he accomplished, and not how things had gone, not what he had acquired or attained, but instead the sort of character that he had. And I'm just here to say that the vision we really need to step into this year really well is not about what we will accomplish, not about what our bank account will look like, not about what we will attain, what position we will hold, where we will move, where we will go to school. The kind of vision that we need first is for who we are becoming. We need new kind of vision around this. Now, if you're not even a follower of Jesus, that's not no worries. This will help you too. In fact, a couple years ago, I read a pretty great study about the people who actually hold on to New Year's resolutions. They actually have descriptors around development, not accomplishment. Instead of, I'm gonna read a book every week for the next year, which almost never happens for most people, instead, what they say is, I'm gonna read more books than I've ever read in a year. I'm gonna become a better reader than I've ever been before. We set those kind of goals around who we're becoming, and they become really, really helpful. And so listen, as we step into the next year, everything the vision that we really need needs to be about who we are becoming. It's the kind of vision that Daniel must have had. What we do, where we are, is just a context for who we're becoming. I love this. A friend of mine, her name's Melissa. She was a student in a ministry I had years ago, but I saw on Facebook she posted something really strong this week. She had said, she's a worship leader and had spent a lot of time leading worship at a pretty large church here in the U.S. But recently, she's had children, and so she's home in a different season of her life. And she received a reminder that was helpful to me, might be to you as well. Her worship leader said to her, listen, your purpose is portable. I love it. The calling on Melissa's life did not depend on her being on a stage or in a particular job role, but instead it follows everywhere she goes, which is the same true for all of us, that who we are becoming will follow us no matter if our job changes, our city changes, our situation changes. And if we learned anything in 2020, it's that things can change when we don't want them to. We have so little control over what and how and when and where. The kind of vision we need first is not about any of those things. It's first about who we are becoming. Some of you already know this, though, because you have toddlers at home who, when you come home and talk about your accomplishments of work, they do not care at all. They don't know that person's name. They don't understand that number. They see something pure about life, and what they care about is what is actually most important, who you are. right? The same is true at the end of our lives. When people are celebrating our lives, people spend about this much time talking about what you accomplished and about this much time talking about who you were. This is the most important. While culture and everything else baits us into believing that we should have a vision and the things that we should care the most about are our accomplishments, our attainments, our acquisitions, that's not true at all. Where we begin, what is most important for those who have had life so fragile come to a near end, there's a reacclimating, a repositioning of what's most important. And it has everything to do with who we're becoming. Which, like I said, is beautiful because it follows you everywhere you go. Doesn't matter what your bank account becomes. Doesn't matter who comes in or out of your life. This is something we can have a vision and live in a direction for that God cares deeply about all the time. Listen, this is, I think, a great tool. Limits, rhythms, support, and vision will help any of us live into a better 2021. We can thrive in the midst of survival. But for followers of Jesus, it goes farther than that. For those of us who have said, you know what, I trust that Jesus has rescued me, and I trust that God has invited me into relationship with him, and he has called us into his purposes. He's actually caught us up in his story, not just entered our story. And when we start living that way, the vision that we need for who we become takes on a whole other level. It's not just functional, it's not just practical. It's deeply spiritual and has a legacy kind of impact. Because we not only need a vision for who we are becoming, but who we are becoming if we're followers of Jesus is all about showing the world what God is like. This is what our vision should be like. And so we have to ask some hard questions. As we imagine ourselves and think about who we are becoming, we got to ask not just what will that mean for my family, what will it mean for my life, what will it mean for my comfort, what will it mean for my bank account or any of these other things. We ask first, how will who I'm becoming affect all the way that people around me see who God is? This is exactly what happens for Daniel. Daniel lives a legacy kind of life, and his character is so clear. And in a moment of standing, in a midst of challenge, what happens is a pagan king sees a clear picture of God in Daniel's life. And he actually begins worshiping God. In chapter 6, verse 25, it says this, then Darius, King Darius, the king of the empire, he sent this message to the people of every race and nation and language throughout the world. He says, peace and prosperity to you. I decree that everyone throughout my kingdom should tremble with fear before the God of Daniel. For he is the living God, and he will endure forever. His kingdom will never be destroyed, and his rule will never end. Listen, this is epic worship, acknowledging God for who he is and saying, you are like this God. You are the best, is like the way I always think about worship. And this pagan king who knew nothing of God because of Daniel's action is declaring clearly who God is. A king who, like all kings, really only cares about his own kingdom is saying, this God of Daniel is the king of a kingdom that will never end. His reign will endure forever. He goes on and he says, this God, he rescues and saves people. He performs miraculous signs and wonders in the heavens, on the earth. He has rescued Daniel from the power of the lions. I wonder if the vision we have for our lives will lead to that kind of response from people who do not yet know God. Followers of Jesus, that is our calling. And so we have to ask, here's a question we're spending some time reflecting on. You can't do it in the amount of time I'm going to give you, so you might want to snap a picture and think about it later. Does my vision, does my picture of the future me, as I think about who I'm becoming, does that lead to people knowing and worshiping God? If it doesn't, we have settled for too small of a vision. We have become distracted and acclimated to too many things around us because our calling, our number one calling, is to paint a clear picture for everyone around us of what our God is like. Now, none of us are perfect, so obviously we don't perfectly reflect God. Only Jesus did that. But instead, every single time we live like God, we can point to every success and every good thing that he's brought into our lives. And when we fail, we get to preach the gospel. We get to say, listen, our failures don't separate us from God. God meets us in our failures, rescues us out of those, gives us a fresh chance, a new grace, speaks us truth into a new direction. Every part of our lives should be pointing people toward God. And my question is, as you imagine yourself in the future, followers of Jesus, what will be the impact on people around you? In 2021, how will my neighbors get a clearer picture of who Jesus is because of the way I live? In 2021, how will the people that I interact with at the ridiculous number of coffee shops that I go see a clearer picture of who Jesus is because of the way I show up, the person I'm becoming? These are the kind of questions that we should be asking. Daniel lived this kind of legacy life. In fact, the kind of potent and massive legacy impact that I imagine for me at 80 years old demands some things of me right now, not just for 2021 impact, but for 2031, 2041, 2051, 2061, Lord willing. I just want to see a great picture. In fact, a friend recently asked me, he said, what's your vision for 100 years from now? I'm like, I'll be dead, bro. I'm 42 right now. But his question, I've spent some time thinking, and it has driven me to action. I've set some new limits. I've embraced some new rhythms. I'm garnering fresh support because of the sort of impact and legacy that who I'm becoming will have on any year that God gives me between here and there. How far into the future can you imagine? Who do you want to be that day? Who is God inviting you to be that day? Followers of Jesus, we have a clear picture of who we are to become like, right? His name is Jesus. Romans 8, he predestined us to be conformed to the likeness of his Son. We become more and more and more like Jesus. So that when Daniel said this in Daniel 6:22, Daniel said, my God sent his angel, for I have been found innocent in his sight. Daniel was such a man of character. He could declare that with authority, and it pointed a pagan king in God's direction. And listen, every one of us as followers of Jesus gets to make the same statement. But it sounds like this: my God sent his Son so that all of us, any of us, every single one we will ever meet can be declared innocent in his sight. Not because we are, but because Jesus paid for all of our lack of innocence so that we would never be separate from God. We get to reflect him and move in boldness and confidence in his direction. Every Christian ever should be able to say this. Because of the person we're becoming, because of the ownership of our failures and the declaration of God's grace, we can say with authority and integrity, my God has sent his Son to rescue me, and you can be rescued as well. You can be found innocent in his sight. He will call you to life. He will point you in the best direction. He will fill you with his Spirit. He will take your weakness and add his strength and create something beautiful from you. I'm in process. I would love for you to join me on this journey. Let's do this. We get to live like that. So some of you, I just want to acknowledge that the person sitting next to you or the person that invited you or pointed you in God's direction, they've been living that way. And the moment you're ready to set off on that journey with them, I pray you just throw an elbow at them and say, let's go. And they'll help you take a next step. Say yes to Jesus. He will reshape you in all of the best ways. He has a picture in mind for who you can become and the impact you will make that makes all of our greatest dreams pale in comparison. He takes all of the good that he's already put in us, the desires that he has created within us, the unique capacities, abilities, history, and experience, and he brings them and combines them into all the best kind of ways. We just need to say yes in his direction, invite his help. So listen, tell the person next to you, tell the person that invited you, tell the person that you know, the closest person you know that follows Jesus, that you want to point your life in his direction, and they will walk with you. Our church will walk with you too. If you find yourself on your own or you together don't know what the next step is, text Made New 21 to 94090. It's a tech, no-touch culture that we're in. You can do that. If you're here on campus, you can swing by Guest Central just out the back center doors after you exit out the sides. Be like, listen, I don't know what the next step is. Some great people will help you. Our destination, without a doubt, is to become more and more and more like Jesus. And so listen, limits will help you into a better year. And taking the space that you create and inserting some great rhythms that are good habits, that'll help. In surrounding yourself with really great support, that's really important because none of us have a great day every day. Sometimes we need really great people to hold our arms up and not let us settle for less than all God has imagined for us or that we've even decided for ourselves. All of that finds its context in a vision that is compelling, that lights us up inside, that when we try to write it down or describe it to someone else, we start talking fast because we're stoked, imagining that possibility. I hope that you'll spend some time reflecting on that. And I hope that you'll take that vision and apply it to all the other 3 things that we've said over the past 3 weeks. Because if you actually want to attain, if you want to live into that kind of vision, you're going to need some limits, because limits keep us from moving away from our vision. Right? It's why you don't, on a road trip with your 4 kids going to 9 national parks, you don't let them have 32-ounce sodas. Because otherwise, you're going to be stopping you're going to be in a kind of rhythm, but it's going to be a very slow one because it's going to be stops all the time. Right? It's not going to work. Right? We need some limits. If you want to become a great athlete, you don't swing by the donut shop every day. Depending on where you want to go, it will dictate what kind of limits you set for yourself. We are not meant to be limitless, and we will not live into the very best vision that God has in mind. And so spend some time reflecting. Here's a question worth having a conversation with somebody about. What limits will help focus me in the direction of this vision? What will point me in the direction of who I'm becoming in all the best ways? Snap a picture, spend some time. You can't answer that question quick. It's not just limits that we need though, right? We need some rhythms, because rhythms keep us moving toward our vision. Limits keep us from going the wrong way. Rhythms keep us moving forward, right? And so you gotta fuel up. The car's gonna need gas once in a while. You're gonna need to reassess the map. When you get to the place, you're gonna need to swing by the visitor center, find the map, get checked in. There's all kinds of rhythms that are gonna be needed for any kind of journey that you're on. And the same thing is true for living into the vision that you want to attain. A teacher of mine once said, I want to be really well read when I'm 75, and so I don't want to waste my time with lousy books, so I'm going to make a plan. Listen, when you have a vision out in front of you, it informs what kind of rhythms to travel steadily, Psalm 37 says, in that direction. And so spend some time thinking, what rhythms will help fuel me in the direction of my vision? And you could even ask him with a question mark instead of a period if you want. I just realized there's a typo. Sorry, I get distracted. What rhythms will help fuel me in the direction of my vision? And then, of course, you're going to need to invite some really great people. Because who wants to go on a road trip alone? Come on. Who wants to go somewhere really epic and inspiring? Who wants to travel and adventure in the best kind of direction and not have great people to share and cheer one another on? People who may not have known to go there, but because you invited them along, they stepped into this epic journey. Or some folks who will inspire and encourage you, bring the best out of you. Listen, in my group, I will bring intensity and direction and focus and relentlessness, and I got to have somebody alongside to say, hey, did you see this awesome thing over here? We should just enjoy that for a minute. We got to have great people. God has good things in mind for really great support around us, inviting people into our vision, beginning with some people around us. Don't wait for other people to add people to your life. Choose great fellow travelers and travel together. Invite them into a more inspiring vision than they had before. Share with them what God is doing in your life and saying, I want to point my life this way. I think God can help. Would you travel with me? Would you hold me to this? Would you encourage me in this? Could you support me in this? We don't need to step out of our existing communities and sometimes not even out of our neighborhood. There are great people that if we would just redefine the relationship and take a step in that direction, that they would surround us and God would do something fresh and new in us and in them. And it'd be really awesome. We need great people to travel alongside. I hope that the people of Canyon Ridge and the ministries of Canyon Ridge become a support for you as you live in Jesus' direction. In fact, after a couple of weeks, in the next couple of weeks, we're going to talk about this frame that we've been in of limits, rhythms, support, and what am I talking about? Vision. We're going to spend 2 weeks applying that to finances. Not to giving and generosity, but how do we really live in the direction of God with our money? But then after that, we're going to talk about this vision and direction for our church, which has everything to do with who we all are becoming. Not some organizational, institutional vision. We'll get to a little bit of that. But instead, how do we all support one another and live in this direction that God has in mind for us? It's going to be great. I hope you'll jump in. Even this support group of people that you have around you, we're going to step into a study called Makers, where for 5 weeks, we're going to invite some people alongside one another to say, let's become the kind of people that God imagined. It's going to be great. Details coming in a couple weeks. It's a great time to start gathering some people around you and say, let's go somewhere epic with our lives and who we are becoming. So one more question, spend some time reflecting. Who will I journey with? Which friend do I need to invite to another level? Which risk do I even need to take in my marriage to invite a different kind of spiritual conversation? What kind of revisiting with my children what we imagine for ourselves, what I need to do to take this journey together so that we're not just journeying around one another, but we're actually traveling together. And only when we paint a compelling picture, when we invite God to paint a compelling picture like he did for Daniel out in front of us, only when we allow him to bring his strength into our weakness and paint a clearer picture than we could ever imagine for ourselves, will we be made new. Because new vision creates space for us to be made new. New limits create some space. We invite God in. New rhythms partner with him. New support keeps us going, and a new vision gives us a place to go. Need all four. So as we wrap up this kind of part of our series and this frame of 4 things, I just want to encourage you to take a few minutes. We're going to give you about a minute or so right now to spend some time reflecting on these 2 questions, really simple questions. What will I do with what I've heard, not just even today, but over the last month if you've been a part of what's going on? What will I do with this idea of limits, rhythm, support, and vision? Knowing it, that's a helpful first step. Agreeing with it, another good step. But things don't change until we take action. What will we do with this? Maybe it's as simple as you'll block out some time this afternoon or tomorrow to sit down with people that you love, or to sit down with God alone and start to imagine and describe, draw pictures, write words. Like arrive at a vision that just lights you up. But not without God. We would never do it without God. And then with whom will you share not only what you've heard in Daniel 6 today, but what you've heard across the course of today through the singing, through the message of what's going on, what God has been doing. Who are you going to share that with so you can invite them into what God is up to? Only because Daniel spoke out about how strong God is was this king able to point his life, or at least for a moment, in the direction of God. What will I do? And who will I share with? 2 powerful questions that drive us into real change. God has an amazing vision for every single one of us. Like the best of all fathers who dreams the best for his kids. He's just waiting for you to create some space to listen. And so let's spend a couple minutes beginning that right now.
All right, everybody, it's time for all of us to be thinking, praying, and asking God, what is the vision he has in front of us? Who are we becoming? Then we can back up with some great support and put in the right limits and rhythms to live into that and watch all that God has in mind. If there's any way that we can support you, I want to invite you to text Made New 21 to 94090, and someone from our church will follow up with you really quickly. We'd love to stand with you. God has great things in mind. Can't wait to see what they are.